1,500 miles to Bashan, 1850. 1,500 miles. 1,500 miles. Not in a car, not in a Jeep, not even in a side-by-side. On foot and in a wagon for 1,500 miles. Over mountains, through gorges, across rivers and deserts. No GPS, no one to call for help, no real shelter, no general stores or resupply shops along the way either. They'd heard stories of the dangers, of people who were never heard from again. Marianne's parents and brother had died on their trek west, not even making it to the Salt Lake region with the other Mormons. It takes a certain kind of person in 1850 to stare 1,500 frontier miles right in the face and still do it. Not sure I'd have it in me. Going west. They would take the Santa Fe Trail. The Santa Fe Trail had been used to deliver goods and people between Mexico and the United States for years. Most recently by the 49ers in search of gold. Just 2 years before Royce, his family, and the other Brewsterite Mormons were to embark on their journey, the United States government used this trail to send troops to fight in the Mexican-American War, 1846 to 1848, including the Mormon Battalion, which we'll learn about at the first location of this museum. Here's how they would get to the land of Bashan. First, the Oatmans and the other families of the wagon train had to travel from northwestern Illinois to Independence, Missouri, the typical launching off point. From Independence, they continue south and west 800 miles to Santa Fe. From Santa Fe, further south and west into northern Mexico before fish hooking back north and west through Tucson and up to the Gila River. They would then follow the Gila River west the rest of the way to Bashan, where the Gila and Colorado rivers meet. Picture an elongated check mark or a square root symbol for any math fans, and that was the plan. There was a limit on supplies, as, for the most part, they would have to carry everything in their wagons or on their persons. Today, we charge our batteries and take water and food with us off-road or hiking. Add a first aid kit, and we're usually pretty set. Imagine what they had to bring to sustain life for humans and for livestock over the coming weeks and months. Tools to repair broken wagons, feed, and who knows what for the couple hundred head of cattle and horses. Food, clothing, shelter, furniture, maybe? There's always tables and chairs in those scenes in the movies. Bedding, lanterns, firearms and ammunition. All of this was carried in 12-foot canvas-covered wagons pulled by a few oxen or horses. Following an established trail did come with its own risks. The trash and debris strewn along the way must have been discouraging reminders of those risks, to say nothing about the impromptu graves they'd come across along the way. The trail followed rivers, the Arkansas, the Rio Grande, eventually the Gila. This was good for water supply and hunting game, but it also increased the likelihood of coming into contact with Indians, who were not always thrilled to have invaders in their lands. Footnote: very few of the wagon train members had any experience with Indians, including Royce Oatman. Mormon doctrine included stories about ancient peoples where the good people just happened to be white and the wicked happened to be darker skinned. This may not have been any different than any other common 19th century white supremacist views, and I haven't seen any formal record of the wagon train's views of the Indians, but I think it's worth noting, as it may have affected how the Oatmans, Brewsters, and other families viewed the Indians they would surely come into contact with. On the trail. In August of 1850, the Oatmans and more than a dozen other families, including James Colin Brewster and his family, would depart on their journey. This was after most of the families waited over a month for the Brewsters to arrive. Not exactly an auspicious start for the young leader. Olive's book later described the trip beginning with happy times, fun and adventure. Kids playing games and getting into a bit of mischief. This being a religious endeavor, the group worshipped every evening once camp was set up, singing hymns and praying. But over time, the Brewster shine began to wear off. The families put so much into this endeavor, leaving their livelihoods, their loved ones, and the land they worked so hard for, in hopes for salvation and a strengthened faith in God. But Brewster underdelivered. He wasn't as charismatic as Joseph Smith, the late Mormon prophet, and the rough conditions of the trail only exacerbated Brewster's bristly demeanor. Many books mention an instance where Brewster finds a stone on the trail and, quote, translates its message, seemingly on the spot. Maybe I'm letting my own skepticism show here, but I imagine there were pretty high expectations from the families, betting it all on the prophecies of this young man. And translating a marking on a stone might have come up a bit short. There were accounts later of Royce being a source of contention among the group as well, specifically causing friction with Brewster. That Royce was a determined man, a difficult man, anti-authority, and so on. I'll perhaps be too forgiving of Royce, as many of these accounts are years after the events, post-massacre, and some even long after Olive's subsequent fame. Besides, I might know what it's like to get grumpy and frustrated on the trail, even when I have nowhere near as much on the line. However true these claims about Royce are, imagine what it was like for Royce's wife, Mary Ann, and the kids. Uprooted from their home and community, the leader of their faith, Joseph Smith, where their worldview comes from, where their friends and neighbors come from, is killed. And now they are part of this obviously smaller sect of the faith, walking to the land of Bashan all day, every day. And now Dad is arguing with Brother Brewster. My guess is they couldn't voice such concerns and worries. But even if they could confide in their parents, the Oatman kids must have learned to toughen up and to stick together through these rough times. Into Mexico. By October of 1850, the Oatmans, the Brewsters, and the other families were in the New Mexico territory. It seems the tensions continued, including when it came to making decisions about the choices before them. The Santa Fe Trail, just like our own forest roads and back trails, had break-off points, spurs, forks, and so on. On the approach to Santa Fe, Brewster wanted to make a stopover to pick up mail, maybe supplies, despite the added time it would take. He might have even wanted to call it quits and set up paradise right there, outside of Santa Fe. Others in the group, including Royce Oatman, wanted to take a new southern route to make up for some of the time lost from leaving so late in the season. But this southern route included some additional risks. Specifically, lack of water and food supplies, as well as added exposure to Indian attacks. Despite these risks, Royce and just over half the families went south, leaving Brewster and the others to their northern route. Weeks and hundreds of miles later, the Oatman group of families was following the Cook Wagon Road that was established by the Mormon Battalion 3 or 4 years earlier. Historically speaking, this was the interstate highway of the time. Native peoples, Spanish explorers, gold rush folks, U.S. troops, and so on. This heavy traffic would continue long after the Oatmans and their group made their own attempt. The Oatmans and the other families were now well into Mexican territory, which was also, maybe even primarily, Chiricahua Apache territory. After hundreds of miles and battling late-season temperatures and high elevations, they eventually came to the checkmark part of their path described above, and so the party pivoted northwest, now exhausted and dragging themselves through Tubac before arriving in Tucson in early January 1851. They would stay in Tucson, resting, healing, restocking supplies, for nearly a month. At this point, a few more families decided against moving on, at least right then. They wanted to stay and grow crops and were encouraged to do so by the Mexican residents. More protection from the Apache raids. Maybe they were about done with this Bashan idea. Maybe they were just more risk-averse. Either way, Royce and a few of the families did decide to continue on. They would go northwest on the Mormon Battalion Trail, past Picacho Peak and Casa Grande to Maricopa Wells. Maricopa Wells. On February 5th, 1851, the Oatman group arrived at Maricopa Wells, about 90 miles north of Tucson. Here lived several hundred Pima, or Acamel O'odham, and Maricopa Indians. Historically, they were agrarians and master irrigators, but this year's drought had led to very few crops. Maricopa Wells was a common stop along the trail, and for many people, it was a life-saving stop. Even the tough and rugged 49ers would later agree that this next segment of the trail, across the present-day western half of southern Arizona, was the most difficult part of the entire trail. So Maricopa Wells represented another launching off point for this crucial stretch. The wells of Maricopa Wells were dug by Cook and the Mormon Battalion on their way to California back in 1846. There are photos online from the 1870s with a building present, but nothing remains at the site today. The families made camp, and a Brewsterite woman, who was not Mary Ann Oatman, soon gave birth to a baby boy. That's right, multiple pregnant ladies. Multiple pregnant ladies walking or riding in a wagon for days, weeks, and months at a time across the western frontier. I cannot even imagine what these women were going through in those conditions. There will be even more Brewsterite babies in the coming weeks. I wonder what effect those frontier births had on Mary Ann, Royce, and the Oatman kids. Urgency? Caution? Anxiety? At Maricopa Wells, there was another big decision for the Oatmans and the other families to make. Option 1. Do we stay? With barely any supplies, fatigued, hungry, and no idea how much danger still lays ahead. Or option 2. Do we keep going? With barely any supplies, fatigued, hungry, with no idea how much danger still lays ahead. They'd already traveled over 1,000 miles, so there was only 100 or 2 more to go. Besides, one could make the argument that tens of thousands of 49ers and other pioneers had already made this very same trip. Were the Oatmans any less determined? Less faithful? Less deserving? Wouldn't God protect them, or at least guide them toward the land of Bashan and where they were supposed to be? How do you make a decision like that? How do parents make decisions like that on behalf of their 7 children? Only a few days after the Oatmans and their companions arrived in Maricopa Wells, they met a young and adventurous scientist named John Lawrence LeConte. LeConte studied and cataloged insects, specifically beetles, later becoming quite famous in his field. He was coming from San Francisco by way of San Diego and Camp Yuma, and was now taking the trail to Tucson with his Mexican guide. LeConte had just come along the Gila River, the exact way the Oatman group hoped to go. Additionally, the newly formed Camp Yuma just happened to be at the confluence of the Gila and Colorado rivers. What do you think was going through Royce's head when he heard of this? Was it fate or God's will? Even if it was just a useful coincidence, it had to give Royce and the other families a lot to think about. Reports of what LeConte told Royce vary. But whatever was discussed, and against the warnings of the Pima and the Maricopa people, as well as the other families still in the group, the Oatmans once again chose to keep going. To keep going. On February 10th, 1851, the Oatmans broke camp and headed west. This time, not a single other wagon train family joined them. This time, they would go at it alone. In the next section, 40 miles of waterless desert. A desperate plea for help. And the last days of the Oatman family. But before moving on, think back to the decision to leave Maricopa Wells, to keep going. Try to forget that some people later called it a fateful decision. Just think about who those people were and what they knew at that moment. How would you have gone about making that decision? If you were there, what do you think you would have done? What would have been some of the deciding factors for you? Would you have held back or tried to go just a little bit further, like some of us do when hiking and off-roading, leaning into the unknown rather than away from it? Talk it over with your group, and when you're ready, go ahead and play the next section. Alone in the Desert, Maricopa Wells to Oatman Flat, February 1851.